Hello, hello, hello. It is me, your True Hill Phenom SP3, back once again with the princess of all the True Hills, Miss Krssi Love.
Hello,
And this
hello,
is
hello.
our Dark Side of the Ring, Episode 5, Jimmy Snuka and the Death of Nancy Argentino. What an episode. I said they like me and Mark Haggerty said in our interview that they kind of bring us down with the Brawl for All episode, and now they shot right back up with this Jimmy Snuka episode. It hit you hard, it hit you fast and in a hurry. As an old school wrestling fan, what was your your initial reaction overall to the whole episode that we saw last night?
I felt like I was watching an episode of the first 48. I thought it was going to be something about more so about him, and then it turned into a murder investigation episode where there was a trial and everything. So I felt like it was either the first 48 or episode of Law and Order SUV. I don't know, like it was Special Victims Unit or something. Like we were just missing Stabler and what's the other one's name? Can't remember right now. But anywho, you know what I'm speaking of. Anyone that watches, Law and Order, you know who I'm speaking of.
Absolutely.
But yeah, and how they covered up, something back in the day.
It's a deep, in-depth story. So we'll do what we've been doing with these last couple of episodes. Start from the beginning. So beginning of this episode kind of starts about the popularity of Jimmy Superfly Snuka, him being one of like the big top baby faces in the WWE at the start of their expansion with the Rock and wrestling movement, and kind of him being like the Hulk Hogan before Hulk Hogan came
Hogan was
into
right.
the
I didn't know that he was heel first, and then I thought he was always a baby face because, well, when I watched, which was like 86 or so, like he was a face. So I never knew that he started out as a heel. But I guess once he was so popular, they showed that they had to make him a face, which is
yeah.
crazy.
They talked about him being managed by Buddy Rogers initially.
His
The
babysitter.
Yeah,
That's not
basically,
my
it,
manager, babysitter.
who was not only his manager, he was his handler. They introduced Tonga Kid, aka Sam Fatu,
He
who
knows
was
what happened. He's covering it up. He acts like he don't know what happened. You're a liar. You're a liar,
the
sir.
nephew, the
Sorry.
nephew, the nephew of the Wasamo was Alpha Zika, and the riding partner of Jimmy Snuka, who rode up and down the road with him, and even like Miss Krssi Love said, was in the car the fateful night that Nancy Argentino was killed.
Supposedly, yeah. Supposedly,
He
like,
and mind you, when he said the night that young girl was killed, he
first,
didn't say she died. He
right.
said she was killed.
And mind you, at first when they first started that whole episode, he didn't even remember her name. He didn't like, oh yeah, that was her. That was his girlfriend. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
he really had me for a moment. Like, does
Yeah.
he know what this
Exactly.
this documentary is about? Like,
Ex-
did he think this is like a positive type of documentary about Jimmy? Because
yep.
I don't think he gets, because he didn't know the girl's name at first. He gets asked about the car ride, and he was like, "Yeah, we was laughing and joking and listening to music, and Jimmy was had this nice cologne, and he smelled real
Mm-hmm.
good." Like,
He's
I just
like,
think he didn't get what was going on here. But I think he did add a lot, basically being that close to Jimmy Snuka,
mhm.
and he did the what they've been doing with like these really hard to touch subjects is they kind of touched on it from both sides of the argument, kind of pro Jimmy Snuka, and then
And
kind
then
of
kind of
we found out and everything that we know now.
correct.
Dom Rocco was also introduced in this initial part. He was the rival of Jimmy Snuka and the former WWF Intercontinental Champion, kind of talking about how Jimmy Snuka grew up poor and that he came
Mm-hmm.
into wrestling and that he was very appreciative of the fans. And that kind of goes into what Tonga Kid talked about with him giving the symbol.
And kneeling down. Didn't know that was what that was for, which was cool. You
Absolutely.
learn. Yep.
That was a nice little touch there. They also introduced Irv Mushnick, who is a wrestling journalist and author. He is the nephew of Sam Mushnick, who's a famous wrestling promoter.
hmm
He kind of more touched on more like in depth stuff. He's a good friend of my uncle Dave Meltzer, Wrestling Observer. So he's a guy that kind of like talked about how like wrestling fans kind of told Jimmy, "Oh, you're gonna go murder a girl again," and all the type
uh,
of like nasty stuff that fans started talking
Ooh,
to Jimmy.
delay.
They also introduced Lorraine Slamone, who was the sister of Nancy Argentino, the stepsister. She said that Nancy was the kind of, and this was good because I felt like that was like a very important part, is kind of telling the story of Nancy. Is that there are a lot of people like you thought this was just like a documentary about Jimmy Snuka, but it was important to kind of tell the story of Nancy as well. And talked about how she was like very stylish. She used to work, but she was also innocent minded. Talked about her friend Ellen, who was engaged to Johnny Rods, who actually helped trained our good friend, our producer, Baby Seth. So shout out to Johnny Rods. And she took her to Madison Square Garden for the wrestling matches back in the 80s. And Lorraine says that Jimmy was basically introduced to Nancy backstage as she was waiting for Johnny with Ellen. Jimmy introduced himself, and they basically instantly fell in love. She brought Jimmy around her. She brought Jimmy around her family, and he was pretty much like isolated, and that was like the first hint that something was different about this one to the family, basically. And then Nancy also they basically talked about Buddy Rogers, and you could talk about more of that, about how Buddy had to stop being the handler of Mr. Superfly.
Yep, pretty much. Like, he kept tired of him being high and being out of control. Pretty much going off the rails like JJ. So pretty much he didn't want to deal with her. So deal with him. Excuse me. So that's how Miss Nancy got the job of taking care of Mr. Jimmy.
Yeah, she had to ride him around as he did his coke, because that was one of the reasons why Buddy Rogers was like, yeah, I don't want to ride around with him anymore. They also introduced Nancy's sister Louise, who added a lot because she told the whole story. She had a lot more,
yes. Yep.
She had the whole story about her interaction with Jimmy, as there was one weekend where the parents were away, and Jimmy and Nancy were having Chinese food together, and Louise came in. And basically was all chatty and bubbly, and Jimmy basically threatened her, basically holding like a choke like symbol
almost a choke hold like stance, like he was about to put his hands around her neck.
And he was like, I could. And as she said, made a wrestling face at her. This startled Louise. She went upstairs, and then she warned Nancy that she needed to get rid of him. And she saw the change in Nancy right there, that she was very like timid, and she was basically apologizing to Jimmy. And Jimmy basically felt that he was wrong and apologized in his own particular way.
That's not really an apology, but whatever. Handing her Coke. Boy, you gotta love the 80s, man. Gotta love the 80s.
That's how you apologize in the 80s.
Right.
Bro. In New York.
In New York. Cause she lived in Mill Basin.
Yeah, Nancy lived in Queens, New York. She was like her sister said, she was in a big city, but she was kind of sheltered. And that's like a lot of kids that grew up in like Queens. I know a lot of kids that I went to college with at St. John's. They were definitely like that. They were sheltered. Yeah. They never really left Queens. They would go to Manhattan maybe occasionally. That would be like a road trip. But that's very, very much I could relate to that, and I understood where they were coming from when they was talking about how she was sheltered like that. They then talked about Jim in the next segment, how Jimmy was married to his wife Sharon while he was and had 4 kids at the time. They had a nice house. They also introduced the 2 journalists who kind of broke this story. Kevin Amron and Adam Clark. They are the journalists who wrote the story of Jimmy Snuka and Nancy Argentino, the 30-year cold case story. The police claim, and then they talked about the January 18th, 1983 incident where Yes, where Nancy called her sister and basically said that Jimmy was chasing her. And then the police reported that Jimmy was dragging her by the hair in a hotel room, and then he had to be restrained by police. He tried to fight off police as well as the police dogs, and just seemed in like a violent rage. He was arrested arrested and then was only released and released without charges because Nancy signed an affidavit which basically relieved Jimmy of all the charges. So from your perspective with that like first initial thing, what was your like whole what would you be as like a sister or someone close to Nancy? Where would you be and what would you be saying to her at this point?
Like, you need to leave this married man alone. He's crazy. There's nothing good coming out of this. Like, he doesn't love you. Like, he doesn't want to be with you. He hasn't left his wife. He has children. Like, get out of there. Like, I really don't understand. But, back then it was kind of like common per se for these type of things to happen, especially like in the 80s, 70s, 80s time. Like, men always would like go out on their wives and have other women. So it's bad that she didn't listen to her sister when she had a chance to, because maybe she could have still been here. Who knows? We don't know. It was 30 something years ago. So, but definitely would have like been like, get out of there. Like, he doesn't love you. Like, this is not you. You are definitely not the person you were before you met him. So
Absolutely. I totally agree with that standpoint. And if I was her brother, I would probably be saying the same thing. So that brings us to a few months later, on May 10th, 1983. Jimmy, Nancy, and then we eventually found out Tonga Kid
he was in a car with them.
were in a car on their way to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where WWF usually ran weekly syndication out of Allentown. And, I like to, with these Viceland Dark Side of the Ring, since we do these reviews, I like to watch it more than once. And, like, the second time, they always hit that stuff and you don't catch it until you watch it the second time. They talk about it. When they initially talk about them going to Allentown, they talk about WWF and Allentown had a very good relationship. WWF ran their syndication weekly there. They had a very good relationship. They were very connected, and they meant a lot financially to the city of Allentown. So that was very specific. And then Irvin Muchnick was the person who spoke about that, the most, because that was like one specific detail that if you missed it, you kind of like everything doesn't really come together at the end. So Jimmy basically. What happened that day, as they first described it, is that Jimmy left Nancy to go do the taping and do a couple of matches. He was gone for about 8 hours. When he came back, she was unconscious. Basically, Tonga Kid and Don Morocco described the story about like an ambulance coming in front of Jimmy's hotel, and basically something was wrong. So then we get a report from basically a synopsis from Shirley Reeve, who was a paramedic who examined Nancy at the time of her accounted death. And she talked about how she had to pull information from Jimmy Snuka. And basically, he admitted that they wrestled the night prior. And
she several people and said what happened, dummy. But the cops failed to like put 2 and 2 together for some strange reason.
We're going to get to the cop.
Okay. All right. Got that down right here. Okay, go ahead.
We're gonna get to the cop. Don't worry. We're getting to the cop. So yes, like Krssi said, he told the paramedic, he told a few people at the hospital all the same thing, that he had something to do with Nancy falling, and that was the whole reason why she was in the hospital. And then eventually she was pronounced dead. She was the family basically found out that information, and they were told by Jimmy that it was like an accident. So they had nothing really to think other than it was just an accident.
It's a plain accident, yeah.
So then they talk about how the police questioned Jimmy, and then at the hotel the next morning. And then in the hotel, he had a whole totally different story. His story was that on their way to Allentown, they stopped to go to the bathroom. Cars were coming down, and Jimmy told her to come back to the car. She turned around very fast and slipped and fell on the side of the road, hit her head. And then when they came back, she got in the car. They went to the hotel. She laid down, and then everything happened as it was said before.
Yep.
So the conflicting story right there. What's your like meter of did Jimmy do it at this point of watching the documentary?
Oh yeah, like he. First of all, if you come in the room, you left her there. Like, something was fishy once you just left her there. Like, you didn't want to say, "Oh, babe, are you okay?" Like, he didn't ask her was she okay or nothing like that. He just like try to wake her up. Not no. He did it. Sorry.
That, that's
Sorry, not
the
sorry. There's nothing
best,
else to say.
best we could say. Next introduces the person that I feel is our least MVP, another least MVP, the LVP of this episode, Frederick Conjure, former
Mm.
chief of police in Whitehall Township,
Liar.
Pennsylvania. What?
Liar. What a
He,
liar.
they
You don't
totally got the wrong person to represent them here.
The wrong person. Like, Vince done gave him some money for sure.
he was like I had nothing else but to believe my investigator. Like, why else would I not believe my investigator? So word starts going around after everything happens the next morning. There's an investigator or a detective speaking to Don Morocco, and Vince Jr. calls.
Mm-hmm.
Don Morocco describes the conversation as Vince Jr. asking if he's heard about Jimmy and his girlfriend, and he's like, actually, I'm here with a detective. Then
Yep.
he puts Vince on the phone with the detective, and Vince says,
Ugh,
and I quote, Jimmy will do anything to cooperate with the investigation. He's immediately released without
please.
any further questioning. A few months later, Jimmy Snuka is back at wrestling, but before then, we talk about the funeral. We go back to her stepsister Lorraine, and when they were asked if the family did think that it was an accident, and you can kind of describe what happened at the funeral, because this was one where I was just like, man, he's just really piling this evidence.
Right, like, just you're not even making yourself even. Like, homeboy shows up, probably high as a damn kite. Who the hell knows? I'm sure he probably either was high or drunk. I don't even know.
He
But he
was
comes
getting
in,
escorted by Buddy Rogers at the time, like they said.
getting escorted in by someone trying to take care of him, and he has on a tank top, flip flops, and some shorts, looking like a tourist. Like, like, who shows up to a funeral like that? And then makes a damn scene saying, "Oh, she looks a mess," all that stuff. Like, what? Like, how do you? What do you mean?
She looks terrible. Is his exact quote to the
See,
family.
she looks
The only
terrible.
thing he said to the family, not sorry for your loss, not anything as
He
such. He
didn't
said
pay for the funeral. Like, didn't do anything. Like, no, someone of remorse or someone that like was involved with this lady, clearly was sleeping with her, clearly making her travel around with him. Well, not making him, but still doing nevertheless. And you do nothing.
before that, they talk about how the detectives did not go with Jimmy to the site of where he said Nancy fell, but they did go all the way to Queens, New York, to tell the family
And
that
the case is closed.
the case would remain open, but they had no other. They were going to mark it as an accident. And at the same time, the Jimmy's promoter, which we assume is Vince McMahon, was calling the family at the time, offering $25,000 to help with their grief, and the mother refused because
Like the money, yeah. She's like,
you
that's
know
not what my daughter was worth. Like, I would have
absolutely
did the same thing. Like, no, you can't buy me. Like,
there's no
you did
price
something.
tag. There's no price tag on that.
And then, like, even that, like, why that shouldn't have been like a red flag to them. Like, how you gonna call and say, "Oh, can you take this? Would you take this money?" Like, no, who
It's
covering up?
sliding it under the table. So from there, they also talk about as Jimmy is saying that she looks terrible at the funeral. The Undertaker also tells them that there was bruises on her
Body.
neck, and they're all over her body, and it took a lot to make her look that good. And that's when the family and the stepfather basically is just like, yeah, it is
It
something.
is. It's definitely
This is
fishy
something
going
more.
on.
Yeah, so they filed a lawsuit against Jimmy Snuka for negligence because she basically neglected to take care of her, even if he wasn't involved with hurting her. If it was an accident, he didn't do enough to make
Yep.
sure she was safe and she was all right.
hmm
So they file a lawsuit. He doesn't show up to the court case, so they win the case due to him not
That's
knowing
showing up. The new wife. I forgot what her name was.
Carol Snuka,
Carol Snuka.
the widow of Jimmy Snuka.
She was like, yeah, I don't know why no one never made him go. Like, it makes him look really, really bad. why didn't she make, why did no one like tell him that he needs to do the right thing so he could at least try to like clear his name? But she was like, she knows something ain't right, and she know he probably did it too. I mean,
she didn't want to say it, but you
right.
can tell that she is grieving by it, and she has a
Mm-hmm.
form of regret that he passed on at the time of his death to her, because you could tell that she kind of knows more or feels a lot more than she was saying or letting on in the documentary, understandably. So from there, they talk about the whole case, and then he's supposed to pay them $500,000 for no show in this court case. He never
Not a
pays it.
dime.
He
Not.
files
How
he
was
files
he
for
not thrown in
papers.
jail from there before? Like, it was like he's like untouchable. Like, he could not be touched at all.
From there, not getting paid that money, the family just want to be done with it. They let it go. They just want to just move on and just deal with their grief. 30 years later, that's where we go back to Kevin Ehrman and Adam Clark. They decide.
They just happen to say, "Hey, let's go and relive or go see what's going on." And mind you, they just like, not even like wrestling fans. They just happen to like.
Well, no, they did talk about how I think it was Adam. Adam is the one who was a wrestling fan, and he's a journalist, and he was like, it's a 30-year case. They're in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's been
Right.
30 years since this case. He's a famous pro wrestler. Why not dive into it and learn a
And
little
see
bit
what's
more?
going on. Yep.
And learn about it. So they asked her for
Police
information
records from the police.
for the
The
records.
police said it was it was still an open case, so they couldn't give them any type of paperwork. Liar.
So then we get to the autopsy report. When that came out, I was like, that autopsy report though.
It was the nail, and that was the last. That was the final one. That was the one that sealed the deal. Yep.
Yeah, it was just like the meter broke. Like at that point of the documentary, the meter on if Jimmy did it broke at the autopsy report.
For sure.
When they basically said that the attacks were something of a stationary object struck to the head, and that it was forms of bruising and scars that were forms of that show proof of mate abuse.
Yep.
And then the
violence.
Ergo, basically. And then the final line basically said, I believe the case should be investigated as a homicide until proved otherwise. And then this is the big one.
No one said anything.
When they brought it up to Frederick Conjure, the LVP, Frederick Conjure said, well, we did investigate it. I was like, we investigated to the best of our abilities. And yeah.
Just horrible. Like, no, you didn't.
Yo, he is probably like one of the worst chiefs of police I've ever seen in my ever-loving life.
That's why he's probably retired and not working in there anymore.
Well, obviously he shouldn't be working because he's not a good representative. He doesn't know how to represent the police very well because he didn't know how to answer a lot of different questions throughout this whole thing. Let's be honest here. But they brought up the autopsy report because that brought up the reopening of the case.
Yep.
In 2014. Adam Clark and Kevin Ehrman contacted the family, told them about the story. They told them what they found out and that they were reopening the case due to the pressure of the public. And then after bringing it to the grand jury, they decided to charge Jimmy Snuka with the murder of Nancy Argentino. So they basically get him into court in 2015. At this point, he had just announced that he had stomach cancer. He was 72 years old. You can kind of see he wasn't very much all there.
Yeah, yep.
So that's why when they said that the lawyer argued that he wasn't mentally able to stand on trial, it totally makes sense. He wasn't at that point. He wasn't. It
was kind of too late at that time. I really feel bad for Nancy's family because it's like they get this close, but yet it gets snatched away because he really wasn't fit to stand trial. I mean, you can just tell in his whole demeanor like he wasn't there. I don't think he was like Harvey Weinstein and playing the game. You know what I'm saying? Like I really feel like he probably was not there. Even though he said in like other reports and like said on radio like what happened and this person ruined his life and all that other stuff like that. But he wasn't fit to stand trial. He wouldn't have been able to testify. Like there was nothing like really to like a lake for them to really stand on.
Yeah, it was too late at that point, and there was nothing really they could do otherwise. But kind of to rewind it back to Adam Clark and Kevin Averman. Before that autopsy report, let's rewind it back to around the time that they're investigating this whole story with the 30 years cold case. They talk about the autobiography or biography of Jimmy Snuka, where he talks about this mysterious meeting after May 10th and the incident when Nancy Argentino, where him, Vince McMahon, and Allentown local authorities had a meeting. So they go to work, and he's going through the paperwork, and he says all of it is very detailed about all the meetings and basically interrogations that they did at the time about the case, except for this one last meeting that there is no description of what was said in a whole hour-long meeting. And in the autobiography, it talks about this whole meeting that Vince basically came in with a briefcase, and then at the end, he came down with the briefcase and told Jimmy everything was all right.
Right, everything was taken care of.
So, what was your thoughts on that meeting and that revelation that Vince McMahon basically helped Jimmy Snuka take care of it?
He covered up he helped cover up a case for his talent person, man. They know he did it. It's sad, man. It's really sad.
It's like and like when they go back to the Frederick Conjure, he's like, I don't even know why this is important. Like, what? Like, are you serious?
What do you mean why this is not important? It is important. Like you this man came in probably from Connecticut, or maybe they was already in Allentown. Who knows? He came. Matter of fact, no, Vince was already probably in Allentown because they were filming there. So he came in with his briefcase and said, "Hey, everything is fine. You don't have to worry about anything." And that was it.
And they talked to Carol, who the widow of Jimmy Snuka once again, and she even wants to know what was said and what happened in this meeting. She said that he used to trust Vince McMahon very much. She used to call him Brother Vinny, and that Jimmy would tell her that sometimes that people would come up to him with paperwork and tell him to sign, and tell him that Vince says that you won't get paid for the night if you don't sign this. So we don't know what Jimmy Snuka has signed over the years due to his very much being trusting of everyone within WWE, WWF at the time. Like,
and they said he couldn't read or write, so basically he was just like just doing whatever anyone just told him to do. Just go out there and just like go have a good night. Just go out there and give us a good show. So
yeah, and then Kara also says that in the autobiography, she didn't really feel like he should have talked about Nancy Argentino. The family was very upset with him, kind of describing her as like a
regular random girl that he met in like
a random girl who was like went crazy and stuff like that was obsessed with him and stuff, and like he kind of like diminished what she was to him, which was pretty much a handler and helping him get around really. And they didn't like that. Like, and then finally in the autobiography, he talks once again about how she got into her accident and doesn't account for that there was another person in the car. So they talk to Tonga Kid. This is finally where we get to that, and he talks about his account of riding with them to Allentown, Pennsylvania on May 10th. Talks about him smelling his cologne and his smelling good. And then finally they asked him, Jimmy told the cops that, she fell on the side of the road. And he was like, no, I don't remember that.
Happen. I don't remember that. I don't recall that happening.
Yo, he got upset. He was like, oh, damn.
Like, I think I said too much. Like, I think I did too much, Like, he knows something ain't right, yo. He know it. He don't want to say it because he loved Jimmy so much. But he know what happened.
He loved Jimmy so much. He doesn't want to see Jimmy in that light. But like, I think after watching this documentary, I also watched After Dark with Irvin Muchnick, and a lot of people were still. Oh, that was really good. It's definitely a good supplementary thing to watch after Dark Side of the Ring, because it's good to hear like the fresh response of the people that were close to the documentary. And they talked to Brian Knobs and Greg Valentine, who weren't a part of the documentary but knew Jimmy Snuka and still saw him in a very like positive light. But like Irvin Muchnick being a wrestling fan, a journalist, and an author, just came on it. He came in as the last guest, and he was like, I think there's just no other way to say it, but after watching this documentary, that Jimmy Snuka murdered Nancy Argentino. He just flat out said it. He was like, after everything we've just learned over the last hour, I think there's no other way to say it, but he did it. Like, it's just flat out. It's right there in front of you. We just gotta admit to it. It happened. It's okay. We don't need to involve, like, it's the same thing with Chris Benoit and what he did. We don't need to involve the David Benoits of the world. We don't need to involve the Tamina Snukas of the world. What they did is what they did. What Jimmy Snuka did, what Chris Benoit did, is what they did. They both are tremendous performers and are going to be known as wrestling legends for what they did on camera in front of our eyes for years and years and years. But we cannot get away from the fact, and I think Adam Clark put it best, that we can't always separate the man from who he was in front of, from who he was in front of the camera. It kind of is intermeaning. It kind of meets together, and you have to acknowledge, yes, he was a great performer, but yes, he was a murderer.
He was a murderer, and he was a problem.
He had a drug problem, and yes, he was a murderer. So I did put this list together of the reasons and the proof of Jimmy Snuka, why Jimmy Snuka, how we know Jimmy Snuka did it.
I told you we said this last week. We will find out for sure if it's just like Carol Baskin, if he did it or not. And we were sure enough had the same thing. Go ahead, Frank. Go with your list.
History of domestic violence. Lied about his story to the police.
Several times.
Released after Vince spoke to the police. How weird he acted at the funeral. The bruises on her neck and body. Didn't show up when the Argentino family filed a lawsuit. It didn't show up for the court case. The autopsy report. His book and the story of his meeting with Vince McMahon and the Allentown local authorities.
His words, no one else's.
His words, no one else's. No transcript of the above a meeting. And finally, never mentioning Tonga Kid was in the car with him and Nancy.
That was like 8 things you just said?
Yeah. I think it's like, I tried to get up to 10. Yes, 10 reasons. 10 reasons why Jimmy Snuka did it. But it's more, like I said, it kind of devolved into the story of how much Vince McMahon paid the Allentown local authorities and how many more stories do we have in the past 40 years of what this man has done to become this global force that is now on one of the short list of people who will help our economy get back to normal in the United States of America.
Yeah. It was said alone that Vince, I was watching Trevor Noah last night, and WWE is now listed as essential workers. Because it was like how they have the WWE listed as people that are working, and they was like, wait, so you have wrestlers? They was like, and Vince said that these are essential workers and they need them to work.
This is all the makings of a future Dark Side of the Ring episode going on right now.
Correct.
So, what's your final thoughts for the Jimmy Superfly Snuka documentary here and the death of Nancy Argentino? Your final thoughts on the documentary and your final thoughts on Jimmy Snuka after seeing this.
It is a very, very sad thing. Like you said before, we have to separate the two. But however, unfortunately, he murdered that girl. He did it to her. I feel so bad for her family. He will always be a legend in his right. He did a lot. However, he is also a murderer. And unfortunately, he is not here to say anything, but he already said what he needed to say in his book. And his action has proven what he's done. So I have no doubt in my mind that he did, in fact, do it. He did it.
So what I said about this whole, it was a compelling, multi-layered story and episode, a great
Yep.
portrayal of all the parties, and it just did an excellent job of categorizing Nancy as more than just a victim. That was my final thoughts for the Jimmy Snoopafly and the dance and the death of Nancy Argentino episode of Dark Side of the Ring.
Mhm.
Next week we got Dino Bravo, who is a famous story. He was a WWE mid carder for you. I know you're probably confused. He was a WWE mid carder, but the infamous story with him is that apparently a lot like a lot of the stories that came out about gorgeous Gino Hernandez from the first season of Dark Side of the Ring. This is a lot about was he basically taken out by the mafia? Basically, it's gonna be
Oh, I
it's
remember.
another.
Yeah, I definitely remember Dino Bravo, one of the early 80, I mean late 80, 90s wrestler. Didn't know. I was very surprised to see that he has a story. So I'm very intrigued and can't wait to watch it and see. So we're gonna find out. We'll have it ready for you next week. I wish it was like Netflix where you could watch all of them back to back, but we can't, you know.
Well, it's gonna get there. It's gonna get there soon enough. But yes, finally, any final plugs or anything you want to promote before we sign it off, Miss Krssi Love?
You will be getting a new SmackDown with the Lynches. They are working on editing it right now, so it should be dropping before the end of the week. Other than that, you'll see us for the next episode of True Hill Heat, 71, I believe, or 70.
70.
Oh,
Big
70.
7-0. Big
70.
7-0 is
Okay.
next up. Absolutely.
I hope by 100 we'll be out of quarantine and we can have a big old party.
One would hope. One would hope. Fingers crossed. But yeah, yes, check out all that great material on the YouTube channel. Put your comments down below. Tell us what you
Like
thought
and
about Jimmy
subscribe.
Snuka and the death of Nancy Argentino episode of Dark Side of the Ring. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Push the subscribe button. Push the bell to stay notified. And of course, right now, since we're in quarantine, we're looking out for all our independent wrestling promotions, our talent, ring
Yep.
announcements, all of the sorts. So go out there and support your favorite independent talent in the wrestling world. So for Miss Krssi Love, it is me, your True Hill Phenom SP3. This has been True Hill Heat, Dark Side of the Ring review, signing off until next time.